Hello, everyone. Good morning and good evening. I'm Aditya Ramanathan. I'm a researcher at the Takshashila Institution, and I welcome all of you on behalf of the Takshashila Institution and Hudson Institute. Before we begin, just a bit about the two institutions for those who are new here. The Takshashila Institution is an independent center for research in education and public policy. We're physically located in Bangalore, but really we've been operating around the world since 2010 over the internet. Takshashila is an independent, non-partisan policy research think tank. And what we're really engaged in is discussing India's relationship with the world, transforming how India is governed, and exploring the intersection of technology, economics, and politics. On the other end of this collaboration, we have Hudson Institute. Hudson was founded in 1961 by strategist Herman Kahn. And Hudson challenges conventional thinking, and they're focused on helping to manage strategic transitions to the future through interdisciplinary studies in defense, international relations, economics, healthcare, technology, law, culture. Now just to orient you, this is also the second in our six-part series, which we call the China Challenge. Our aim in these conversations is to answer one question really, which is how India and the US can and should respond to China's increasing assertiveness and its growing global ambitions. The format we're using for these conversations is what we call a deep webinar. These are thoughtfully curated conversations that bring together great panelists with discussants from diverse backgrounds. And hopefully we have an engaging conversation at the end of that. Today, we've got two people who really understand China and the impact of its rise. From Hudson, we've got Liselotte Odgaard. She's a visiting senior fellow at Hudson. Her work focuses on policy analysis in the field of development cooperation, global multilateral cooperation. She's done work on US-China-Europe relations and on Arctic policy. She's been a visiting scholar everywhere from Harvard University to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and the Norwegian Nobel Institute. From Takshashila, I've got my colleague Manoj Kewalramani. You might know Manoj from his Twitter handle, the China Dude. Manoj is fellow China Studies at Takshashila. His research focuses on Chinese politics, foreign policy, and approaches and how it approaches new technologies. Manoj has been a journalist for more than a decade, during which time he's reported from all over, including from China. Welcome, both of you. And joining us are also our three discussants. Soumya Ashok is an independent journalist who was the Beijing correspondent for the Indian Express until last year. Then there's Ram Ganesh Kamatham. Ram is an independent writer and researcher. He's one of those ridiculously multi-talented people who make the rest of us look bad. And we've got my colleague Prateek Vagre. Prateek is a fellow researcher at Takshashila. His research interests include the impact of technology in democratic network societies, internet shutdowns, information disorder. So very relevant topics for today. So what are we going to discuss today? We're going to discuss what the rise of China means for the future of freedom. Why is this topic coming up? Well, over the last 4 or so years, we've heard a lot of concerns about democratic backsliding all over the world. You know, in the 1990s, the ascent of democracy seemed unstoppable. Today, even in established democracies, there are serious concerns about backsliding. And these concerns about eroding norms, about weakening institutions, have been expressed in both India and the United States. We've also heard similar concerns expressed in Eastern Europe. Now, whether or not these concerns are justified, they come even as this authoritarian and increasingly assertive China makes its presence felt in the world. And what we really want to unwrap over here is, does the rise of China have anything to do with this democratic backsliding? And if so, what can we do about it? So I want to start right away with our panelists. I'll start with you, Liselotte. We hear a lot about this, about China's model of government. And a lot of people speak very highly of it. I mean, yes, this is an authoritarian country, but they've lifted millions of people out of poverty. But what is China's model of government? And how do Chinese themselves see it, and how is it perceived elsewhere?
Thank you for the question, and thanks for the invitation. I should mention that I also work for a Danish Defense Command, and so I have to make a disclaimer that my views are strictly my personal views and not those of Danish Defense. About China, I think it very much contributes to the undermining of democracy globally. Indeed, I think it's the leading power in doing so. China is a totalitarian society today, in my opinion, because the Chinese Communist Party penetrates all major sectors of society from top to bottom, and its control of its own population is widespread. And therefore, it's actually also quite difficult to unravel the power of the Chinese Communist Party, because it's an integrated part of all societal structures. So even if you wanted to roll it back, I think it's very difficult, actually. And so for the Chinese citizens, you know, this totalitarianism means that a lot of them are also very tightly controlled. And today, because of the technological developments, even if they go abroad, you know, you can still be controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And I think that is the sort of scary part about China's global power. China's policies vis-a-vis the outside world, I would argue, are imperialist in the sense that China aims to control other countries as much as they can, if necessary, by using force. In that sense, I actually think you can compare China's policies to Europe's policies in the 19th and early 20th century, although of course the instrument China uses have changed immensely. You know, at heart, I think you can call it imperialist, since the process is the same. So what China does is, yeah, for example, it tries to push, it uses economic power to push other actors out of main markets that it wants to dominate. It weakens other countries' economic structures, if they're market economic, replacing them with a very different version of market economy, which has significant planned economic features. Countries that are dominated by Chinese influence risk being caught in a debt trap where they cannot honor the financial obligations they have signed up to with Chinese actors. China also gradually changes the rules of conduct of the world, so it works through institutions and gradually tries to change how we interpret the existing rules in a way that favors Chinese interests. This happens with regard to the law of the sea, which is relevant for China's maritime claims in the South China Sea and other places. China also uses economic influence for political and military strategic purposes. It does that covertly behind the scenes, and so it's also very much a hidden influence that can be hard to detect.
Right. But how would, say, a country like Serbia, which has close relations with China, perceive China's model of government? Does that, and how does that perception play into Serbia's own politics, for example?
Well, you know, moving towards Europe, and in Europe, of course, authoritarianism is on the rise. It's a complex process, and a lot of people would argue that China has succeeded also in undermining liberal democracy in Europe. I am actually more skeptical of whether China will be successful in Europe, because there are two different processes underway here. China has tried to make its influence in countries in the south and eastern part of Europe that feels neglected sometimes by the European Union, but it hasn't actually been very successful. So I would say Serbia is an exception. And there's another process which going on, which is, you know, the whole Brexit question. And I think that has actually strengthened, you know, the awareness that in the majority of European countries, the remaining 27 member states, that they should stick together. And so there is a lot of more voices today making themselves known in the European Union. And that means you have obviously more diverse views, including more authoritarian views. But because of Brexit and because no other country wants to end up being excluded, actually in the day-to-day workings of the European Union, even those that seem more problematic in the media, such as Hungary and Poland, are very cooperative, because the last thing they want is to be thrown out of the European Union, because they know they can only have global influence if they're part of the European Union. That's the lesson from Brexit. So popular support for the EU is bigger than it has been for many decades today. And I think therefore China has had actually limited success in undermining the European Union, to be honest.
Okay, well, that's good to know. Manoj, I want to ask the same question to you. The general impression of China is that this country is ruled by these supremely competent technocratic elites who all dress in black suits and are all men, and they just figure out what to do, and that just gets done, and China is just the best country in the world. Is that true?
Hi, thanks so much, Aditya, for having me here, and thanks so much, Liselotte. I think that answer sort of made things easy, because you covered a lot of things that I wanted to say. I want to sort of roll back first and sort of start with the question that begins this event, right? Securing freedom. Freedom for whom? Whose freedom? And I think there are sort of three axes that I would look at that to begin with. First is the individual. Second is corporations, civil society, organizations, non-governmental organizations. So freedom of sort of collective action in one way or the other, whether it's for profit motive or not. And the third thing is the space for actors on the international arena, which are primarily, in my view, states. Of course, there are multilateral agencies also, but states is the primary actor that I'm looking at. To me, China's rise in some way structurally alters and reduces the freedom for all three of these, but for very different reasons. From an individual point of view, there is a certain ideology that gets credence with the rise of China, with its economic performance and the sort of demonstration effect that it has. For corporations and civil society, we are seeing that currently play out, right, between the US and China, where, you know, corporations are being squeezed from both ends. It's not like corporations in China were not squeezed politically in the past, but so they're being repaid by the same coin and with some interest, I guess. So I think that's the other aspect of it. For states, there's a change in terms of how you adapt to this, right? How do you adapt to it in terms of your domestic policies? And we're seeing that play out in terms of 5G. And also for states in terms of international politics. If you're going to see a new Cold War, our choices as, say, India, Singapore, Indonesia, start to get far more constrained than they were in the past. So in that sense, for different reasons, the rise of China sort of constrains freedom across the board. Now to sort of answer your question quite directly about the model of government, and are these sort of jet black heads, black suit wearing 70-year-old, sorry, not 70, Xi Jinping is still not 70, but sort of elderly gentlemen, technocrats who are experts at running government, are they the sort of model that the world should follow? I mean, I think firstly, it's important to sort of go and look back at what the Chinese model is. To me, there's a question in the chat also which talks about, can we see China rolling back towards a democratic model? And I don't think you're going to see that. And I think the Chinese have been quite clear in telling us that for nearly a decade at the least. In 2012, Hu Jintao spoke about the fact that China will never adopt a Western-style model. And that was as clear as he could have been in at the 18th Party Congress. Xi Jinping sort of took that forward. The Chinese sort of theory bureau of the propaganda department tells us that, you know, a system of governance within a country must be the product of its own political experience, its own economic conditions, its own cultural norms, and its own historical experience. That tells you that there is a particular, specific, unique China model that they're looking at. And Xi Jinping has essentially sort of doubled down on this, particularly when he sort of, clamped down on what are seen as westernized universal values, so things like human rights. What has he done instead? He's instead looked at, improving efficiency in governance, carrying out ideological education and crackdowns which are associated with that, undertaking sort of legal changes within the system to reflect the norms that you want to push, to reflect the values that you want to push. And these sort of are captured within 12 core socialist values. And if I read them out to you, they'd be absolutely anodyne, right? They include freedom, they include democracy, they include rule of law. Yet it's really interesting as to how they've been classified. Freedom is looked at from a societal point of view as opposed to an individual point of view. So the community is above the individual. And those things find sort of resonance in legal frameworks in the country. And that's how the sort of system then plays out at an individual level in terms of what an individual does or what an individual is free to do, say on social media. Or for example, what Li Wenliang was free to do in late December, early January, when he was reprimanded for bringing out the fact that there is a unique disease that's out there in Wuhan right now. The other thing is that from an economic point of view, it's about the state controlling the commanding hearts of the economy, and the state not just doing that, but the public sector leading the private sector in many ways, and the state directing the path of development. Finally, from sort of a governance point of view, the approach has been about improving efficiency. And this is what the Chinese sort of talk about, right, in terms of their poverty alleviation, in terms of sort of the response time that it takes you to set up a business and those sorts of things. And those are the kind of things that might be attractive to sort of countries abroad. So that's how I would classify the Chinese system, where there is a serious element of social engineering, totalitarianism that is accompanied by top-down control, state directing activities across the board, and actually not even the state, the party, which is what Xi Jinping has emphasized, right? The party's primacy is what is emphasized over the state, with the party sort of cannibalizing the state. So that's the model. The rise obviously has therefore curtailed freedom, because as that model has shown a demonstration effect of success, at least in terms of economic development, there's an appeal there's an appeal to other countries looking at similar objectives.
All right. Okay. That makes sense. What I'm going to do is we're just going to start a poll and ask our audience what they think. The poll question is, Soumya, can you have that up?
Yeah, it's already there.
Awesome. Yeah. Okay. So the question is simply, is China's model of government better suited to developing countries? Yes or no? Okay. We'll see what people have to say to that. In the meantime, we'll just move on to our second question, which is, as a follow-up, I want to ask both of you, how has China's model eroded the appeal of the liberal democratic model, especially in Asia? Liselotte, you've touched upon Europe. Do you get the sense, for example, in the broader Indo-Pacific, that this model is a serious rival to, say, the model presented by the United States? And is there something that, for instance, the United States and India can do to invigorate that model again, to increase its appeal?
Yeah, I think China has been quite successful in rolling out its model across the world for a number of reasons. One important reason, I think, is that China have been very good at plugging into regional needs that have gone unmet, including in Asia, but actually also in other regions, even the Arctic region, which is mine, because, the West has sometimes been very focused on values, especially Europe in its foreign policy, and denied countries in various regions in Asia, Africa, assistance if they didn't follow basic liberal rules of political rules included domestically. Whereas China has been more, and China goes in where others neglect. So if there is a need for infrastructure, for recognizing that an election is free and fair, even if it isn't, China will come with economic support, political support. So every time the West tries to punish countries in Latin America, Africa, or Asia, China has been very quick to go in and say, we'll support you, we will help you. And so they present a benevolent face to the upper levels of societies. And so they have been welcomed even where popular resistance can be quite big, such as in Central Asia. China has gained huge influence in that way. China is also very good at initially presenting a benevolent face to the world. And again, that's not special for Asia. That also happens in Africa, Arctic, and other places. So, for example, in my own region, in the Arctic, they will, take a huge interest in environmental issues, which have been neglected. And also infrastructure, they have tried to buy into that because, these countries are periphery, or these region is the periphery in their own countries. So they are interested in alternatives to their own governments, who doesn't always invest enough as they see it. And then again, China will say, we'll invest in you, we will pay for environmental improvement, etc. And then along down the line, the countries find out, well, that comes with political influence, because, for example, the Faroe Islands, which is part of the Kingdom of Denmark, they have a very lucrative fisheries agreement with China, so they get a very good price for selling their fish, and that's what they live on. But now China has started exercising political influence, for example, demanding that the Faroe Islands take Huawei as their 5G provider if they still want to have that good, agreement behind the scenes, but it was revealed. So in that sense, I actually think what happened in Asia to many countries, it has happened across the world. So Asia is not special in that way, but I also think that it will backfire many places. We've seen that in Malaysia, which has pushed back on Chinese agreements, which are often very intransparent, and negotiated better deals. So it's also because the West has neglected presenting alternatives, but that's starting to come now as Europe, Japan, the United States coordinate their infrastructure, connectivity projects, etc. better, and are more serious about finding funding for it. Then I think, of course, the countries would be happy to have that as an alternative, so they're not just, left with China in some cases as the only country that's willing to invest in them. That's very much the situation in Central Asia, for example.
Right, but for example, if you look at the United States, do countries in Europe or Asia look at the US model with disappointment today and maybe turn towards China?
That's true, but the US is not the only country which represents the liberal model. I also think a lot of people recognize that there are some societal, transformation in the United States that are taking place, but it doesn't mean, that the US in the long run will not be a good representative of liberal values. They've always had a different interpretation. They're more freedom oriented, whereas Europe is more equality oriented. But, I think there's also problems between Europe and the US, but they can be fixed. I think US was one of the first countries to focus more on their national interests and less on values, but that has pushed Europe and other countries in the sort of the liberal part of the world to do the same. So we'll see the same process actually, I think, in India, in Japan, and in Europe itself. More focus on interests and, maybe a healthy process where cooperation in the liberal group of countries will be, more realistic based on where can you find common ground and where you can't. That doesn't mean that you play it out in public, those disagreements, so that you support China's, rise or support for authoritarianism. But when we have gotten used to that process, I think it can actually be very healthy. Another thing that's also happening, you know, as the US is less willing to pay for, you know, keeping liberal world order alive, it will transfer responsibility for that to Japan, to Europe, to India. And that means the US is also going to have to learn to accept that these countries will behave more independently and, you know, will have their own agendas. But having lived in the US for a while now, I also think that a lot of politically influential people in the US recognize that that's the kind of allies and partners that the US needs. It needs partners who can act independently. And as long as we have better coordination of, then a lot of the objectives with regard to China, for example, are the same. We may focus on different instruments. So the US often uses hard power and confrontation. Europe likes soft power and, you know, more pragmatic diplomatic means. But that doesn't mean if we don't coordinate that we can't work towards, you know, the same basic objectives.
Right. Okay. I'm just going to share a poll that we did with our audience. We had 64 respondents, and the question was, is China's model of government better suited to developing countries? And 36% said yes. I did not expect that. Another 64% said no. Manoj, how, when I look at such a poll, I really have to ask you, how is China's model of government viewed in Asia?
Look, I think that's a complicated question, right? And I don't think that it's that straightforward. And I think Liselotte made the point about China sort of entering areas where there is a need, whether that's in infrastructure, technology, and those sorts of things, and where countries have felt constrained because of different reasons in terms of the kind of funding that they can get, in terms of the kind of investments that they can get. You've seen this in Asia, we've seen this in Africa. But I think it's sort of, there is a structural change that's taken place. I mean, as much as I echo what Liselotte said with regard to the US, the European partners, the US, along with India, Japan, Australia, needing to work together to deliver sort of credible alternatives to Chinese sort of economic diplomacy. There are sort of deeper things that are at play here, and I sort of want to first briefly talk about that before saying perhaps what these countries can do. So in some ways, if you look at it, there is a demonstration effect. There's a performance demonstration effect of the Chinese model. And you're seeing that today, right, in terms of what's happened with the pandemic. Two of the countries that are worst hit in terms of the numbers and in terms of how they've managed the pandemic, essentially, are the US and India. So in comparison, whatever one may think about Chinese numbers and data, you can't fake children going to school. You can't fake economic activity that's actually taking place. So there is obviously a change that's taken place in China, and that has a demonstration effect with other countries. So that's sort of first point. And this happens with regard to economics also. And the Chinese have realized that, and not just in this context, but going sort of down, sort of coming down to here also, where they've sort of spent time, effort, energy on propagating their model and the sort of power of their model. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that Chinese investments, while they've created debt bubbles in these countries, sort of BRI partner countries, they've also exported that economic model. And the Chinese economic model, there are many Chinese economic models. The primary sort of underpinning of it is that you invest heavily in infrastructure. You know, build the road and business will come. And that will mean picking up debt. And that's the case with China today, right? Over the last, since 2008 onwards, they've picked up debt to the point where it's now 300% of GDP. It's China's unique conditions politically which allow for that to be sustainable in some ways, although that remains to be seen how long that's going to be sustainable. But in other countries, the argument is that that's the reason why debt is picking up and so on and so forth. Does it create conditions for China to sort of leverage that situation for political ends? Of course it does. Will they do it? Of course they'll do it. But that's the other aspect of the model, that the model creates these sort of structural linkages and structural sort of economic dependencies, not just in terms of dependencies on China, but also on the nature of how you go forward developing your country. The third aspect is how China has engaged in multilateral agencies. It spent considerable time, effort, energy on expanding its stake in multilateral agencies. The UN sort of being one sort of broad agency where I talk about. Earlier this year, we learned that 4 of the 15 specialized agencies in the UN are headed by a Chinese individual, a Chinese citizen. We saw this in sort of India, as if sort of people in India who are familiar with the whole Hafiz Saeed saga, if you go back, the bargain was about China getting the presidency at the FATF. So they value this because they see it as an opportunity sort of to push forward an agenda, they see it as a lever of power, which can allow you to legitimize your sort of system, your space, your control, your engagement globally. And I think that's the other thing. And that's coincided with the US in particular, sort of walking away from multilateral agencies. Who would have thought that we'd be sitting in an era where China can command far more votes on, say, things like its policies on Xinjiang or Hong Kong, or who would have thought that China could sort of be outlining a unique concept for human rights, getting significant amount of support for it. So I think there's sort of deeper changes that are taking place, which we need to sort of be mindful of, which make the model far more attractive for people. Are countries coming to terms with the pitfalls of these models, of this model? Yes, they are. Malaysia, like Liselotte said, was an example. You've seen in other countries, Maldives is an example. Myanmar, for everything that's said about China's influence in Myanmar, there's been really hard negotiation about the port that they want to develop in Myanmar, to the point that its valuation came down from $7 billion to 1-point-some billion. So it tells you that there is pushback. But I think we need to also see that the Chinese are adapting to this pushback. So it's not a static system that does not respond. It is being able to adapt. And last year's BRI forum sort of showed that. So I think we need to be far more cognizant of the fact that the Chinese system does actually adapt to these challenges. Now, what can sort of countries like India, the US, Japan, countries in Europe do? I think the primary answer is what Liselotte has given, right? You need to actually provide a credible alternative. And that has to come in terms of tangible terms, put your money where your mouth is. But also, at the same time, it's important to stem the sort of retreat of democracy at home. It makes no sense for you to go out and propagate values like freedom, individual freedom, human rights, and all of that, while you're actually curtailing them at home. It makes no sense. And the argument is very weak when you propagate the idea of multi-party elections, popular representation, when you're systematically undermining them within your own system, domestically. So I think that's the first thing. And also along with that, value individual rights within your sort of own systems at home. The other thing is that along with that, I think it's important to sort of invest in sort of not just provide an alternative, but also provide transparent investment systems where countries know where you're investing, propagate the fact that you're investing not in a boondoggle project of a local politician who wants to continue, which the Chinese often do, but actually invest and show that you're investing in the future of a country, of a nation, as opposed to a politician's future because you want him or her to remain in power. And I think propagation of that is also important. Lastly, I'd say sort of it's important to engage at multilateral forums to compete with this idea that the Chinese have been pushing. And it's not the Chinese alone, but to sort of compete with this sort of overreach of authoritarianism, the overreach of sort of populism in our thought processes, and also how they're represented in our multilateral institutions. I think those are some of the things that can be and should be done to sort of stem this tide of populist authoritarian rise.
Okay. I want to just open up to our discussants right now, Manoj. We'll start with Soumya Ashok. Soumya, do you have a question for our panelists?
Yes, I have a comment that leads into a question. I would like to focus more on what is something which I find a subtle policy, which is language imposition. So we saw the news about Mandarin imposition in Inner Mongolia and the sort of curtailing of individual rights. And like Manoj said, the idea of a diverse society, and part of that is language and expression. And if we're talking about the export of norms and values, then how does that happen through language as well? So how do you then tell your future generations what it is that you stand for? Now, China does this in two ways, I find. One is very directly. So when you look at Nepal, for instance, the imposition of Mandarin being compulsory in schools, where they also offered to pay teachers wages directly. And the other is someone I met last year, a journalist from an African country, who was talking about the communication as such, like the tool of using CCTV and CGTN as ways for countries to know about China. But the point she made was she switches on her TV, she sees CCTV, but it is entirely in Chinese. And so the nuance of I need to sort of tweak my product to actually be more relatable to an audience far away from China is something that I find throughout my experience of reporting from there. I found that part was sort of missing in the way that even if they had this idea of let's sort of send ourselves out there, sometimes the nuance was not, it was completely not there. The other part, which I find is much more sort of subtle, is actually inspired, right? This idea of language imposition, how that's inspired even the Indian model. In the last 8 years, you see Hindi being something that very consciously being is used as a language of political, it's a political tool. And as a Tamil speaker and as a person who feels very proudly about it, I obviously feel that, you know, other parts of the country are not sort of given equal attention. So in that sense, language itself, the imposition of one homogenized way of looking at the country is in a sense, I feel, is an inspired model from China. And I wonder if you can make that argument for any other part of the world. I'm sure America is not something, it's an English-speaking country, but I'm wondering what your views are about language as a tool of imposing norms and values on other societies.
Well, I think that's an extremely important point. You know, again, China has been, you know, even in countries where it's unpopular, it has this awareness that for, you know, most people, the future of their children is, you know, a key priority. And if China is the country that offers to pay for a good education for their children, that's where they'll send them. And that's what China does in many countries, again, where the West has, you know, neglected to invest. It offers, you know, free education, but then part of the package, as you point out, I guess, is that they learn Mandarin. The best are sent to China, so they will also, you know, be an integrated part of Chinese society and learn, you know, how to do things the Chinese way. And that's another hugely neglected area, I think, by the West, which is only now paid attention to. How, you know, this whole, it's not just about language, it's about, you know, again, including these people in the cultural, economic, and language practices of China. And it's only now, I think, that the West has become very aware that we could do that too. It's, you know, if we offered education to people's children, you know, if we were more aware of investing in that, then people would happily accept it. Because again, for many of these countries, there isn't much of an alternative to a really good education, which can give you a well-paid job, than what China offers sometimes. And if it's free, then the poor, at least the poorer parts of the population, will go along with that. And that's a very clever policy that I, again, think, you know, the West should be more aware of and could actually easily, you know, provide an alternative to in many cases, if we were willing and able, you know, got our act together to do it.
Yeah, I think yeah, that's an interesting point, right? I mean, it's going to be difficult to get whether it's the West or India's act together on that front, given that both so India and, say, the US and parts of Europe also are sort of, there's a trend of, you know, looking at immigrants with greater suspicion than the past. So that's probably going to be even more difficult now. But I mean, to that, Soumya, to your point, I think that you've hit on a question which sort of, in many ways to me, predates the modern PRC, right? Because you're essentially talking about philosophically, how do we look at a nation? What do we define as a nation? And what is our approach to a nation? Right, in some ways, language is therefore deeply political and has always been deeply political, even before you had the PRC. Right, whether it was in Europe during sort of the rise of Germany, whether it's in India, where through our independence movement and subsequently also this debate over Hindi and the other languages is sort of older than that model. Now, there is a strand of thought, and I think this has to do with the demonstration effect aspect that I was talking about. If China had not developed over the last 40 years to the point where it is today, would this have been valued? That homogeneity is something that we must aspire to. So if you look at the discourse in India around this, anytime that you hear this, it's about homogeneity will bring unity of action and purpose, and therefore hopefully development and so on and so forth. And then China is sort of talked about as one model where that happens. And the idea that the more raucous discussion debate that we have, the more it sort of holds us back. And it's sort of tied into that broader idea. So in that sense, I would say, yes, the success of China sort of informs of that. And I think whenever people make that argument, it's important for those who don't believe in that to push back by saying, well, okay, let's just look around the sort of larger ethnic minority regions of China, whether it's Xinjiang, whether it's Tibet, whether it's Inner Mongolia, and homogeneity has not brought you security. Neither has it brought you in that sense satisfaction for individuals. Would you like to live in a homogeneous society with the kind of security state that exists? And perhaps people will say no. And hopefully that's the demonstration effect that I think we should argue for.
Awesome. Yeah, I think any project to impose homogeneity in India is just bound to fail. I'm going to move on to Ram. Go ahead, Ram.
Thanks, Liselotte. Thanks, Manoj, for this lovely chat. I feel like we've slipped, when we mentioned the phrase backslide several times, we also seem to have slipped back in time, as we have phrases like neo-imperialism and neo-colonialism as actually fairly accurate representations of Chinese behavior in different parts of the world. I have a brief comment and then a question. We are seeing a situation where multiple narratives around China have begun to sort of unravel. One narrative is the Thucydides trap, which sees the US and the China inevitably pitted against each other in a kind of an inevitable war. And that's one narrative we hope will actually not take place. The second narrative that was very popular in the 90s and maybe the early 2000s was that as China liberalizes, as China develops as a market economy, that it would necessarily also liberalize back home. And that's another narrative that has completely come apart and come undone. And I feel right now we're in this strange moment where we're seeing the Chinese stepping into a gap that the US is creating, whether deliberately or inadvertently. And I think, Manoj, you touched upon it in terms of the US increasingly reneging on its responsibilities within multilateral institutions and China coming into that space. And so we seem to be in this moment where the Chinese are coming into this gap, and we have to now make sense of what that narrative that we actually want to create in that space. A very minor instance, I would just touch upon two regions of the world. For example, peacekeeping operations in China and China's participation in those operations were practically non-existent till 1990. They had no engagement with the rest of the world up until 1990. And subsequently, their participation has also often been criticized as very narrow. And deployments in South Sudan and Mali are seen to be supposedly in the internationalist spirit, but very much just defending a very narrow conception of Chinese interests. So that's one way the neo-colonial game is probably going to be playing out in Africa. The one that's far more frightening for me is the ASEAN situation, where smaller countries find themselves being bullied by China, and through the situation in the South China Sea, the arbitration with UNCLOS, which the Philippines unsuccessfully tried to bring China to the bargaining table. But what we have is a situation where the smaller states are having to choose between a liberal order that the US is not really willing to hold up anymore, and a Chinese alternative that seems to be rather unpleasant one in terms of its the strings that come attached to it. My question is, sorry, and the last point, if I may stretch it on, I love the point, Manoj, that you made, that actually one of the greatest benchmarks that we have for determining the liberal order is not this sort of dated conception of nationalism, which is a singular religion, a singular language, but how we're able to treat our minorities. And we seem to be forgetting that pluralist societies are really the way we want to go as far as the liberal order is concerned. So my question, which I would like to pose to both panelists, is how do you see the defense of pluralism being deployed against China, criticizing their human rights record and how they treat their minorities and how they have implemented various policies in their border regions in Tibet and also in Hong Kong, and you're seeing them sort of consolidating. How do we present this united front that demonstrates that the pluralist approach is actually the significant one? Thank you.
Well, as you allude to, there is a rising authoritarianism across the world, and I think that takes place in all regions, but there are also, significant differences, and no society is perfect. It never was. So I'm not sure that, even if fundamental institutions are rolled back, for example, in some countries in the European Union, fundamental democratic institutions, I think here it's quite important that the union itself tries to push back at that. As I said, I don't think it's as serious as it's presented in the media, because I know on a day-to-day basis, the countries are basically still cooperative and everyone backs, the fundamental values of the European Union. But that being said, I think it's important to also push back at those tendencies and demonstrate that there is a limit to how far you can go in Poland and still be part of the European Union. Because otherwise, as was said before by Manoj, it's difficult to go out in the world and propagate pluralism, which is a fundamental part of liberalism. However, I still think that the West can do that. I think even though there's some rollback in those countries and also in non-Western liberal democracies, you can still clearly see who is fundamentally, whose societies are fundamentally rooted, I would say, in liberal values and which societies are not. And I guess instead of the political conditionality attitude that some countries, at least in the West, have had before, maybe it's more important to have a more pragmatic attitude actually and see where you can improve institutions, even if they're not perfect. We could plug into, in a positive way, democratic institutions, for example, in Indonesia, to push back at the more sort of authoritarian elements that emerge there, support, again, schools, education, which helps people, empowers people to make their own choices, rather than saying, well, things has to be at a certain level before we want to pay for anything. I think a more pragmatic support for fundamental education, free press freedom, etc., in countries that are still, where you can still make a difference in terms of their political development, I think would be important. And coupled with the increasing willingness to be harder on China, where they, really violate fundamental freedoms, for example, in Hong Kong with the sanctions and pushback that has been in that case. So I think, a combination of being much harder on China, where they violate fundamental freedoms and where we have some influence as, liberal democratic societies would be good, combined with, like we ourselves are not perfect, we should also, adopt that attitude to other countries, but where there is potential to strengthen basic democratic, a variety of democracies, because democracy can be many things. Indian democracy is very different from Europe. It's not perfect either, but everyone would recognize that, you know, that's democratic. So the same could be applied in a lot of other countries. A more constructive attitude, I think, would be helpful.
Manoj?
Yeah, I just want to add a little, sort of 30 seconds to that, is that I agree with everything that Liselotte said. The only sort of, from an Indian context, I'd say it's important for people to sort of keep standing up and be counted for. It's important for people not to be counted for just for the people that they like, but actually for institutions, and ensure that those institutions are actually supported. And it's important for people to sort of also vote through their pockets in some ways with regard to the media, in terms of shutting down what you don't think is valuable enough or valid enough. You know, I think those are the kind of things that we do. Essentially, from my point of view, from an Indian domestic point of view, it's important for the people to sort of make sure that they push back against what is in many ways a slide of institutions and their effectiveness and their sort of democratic nature. And that's where I would sort of place the responsibility on.
All right, we have less than 10 minutes left. So Pratik, you're next. And if answers are brief enough, we'll try and squeeze in an audience question as well.
Okay, yeah, great. So I can see a lot of good questions coming in, so I'll keep it short. Given we're in the information age, right, let me bring up the elephant in the room, which is the internet itself, or if I may call it the dragon in the zoo, the Chinese model of internet governance. Right now, how much of a role do we, my question to panelists is, how much of a role do you think the relative success, I say relative here, relative success, China's model of internet governance or information governance is going to play going forward? And the quick second part to that question is, the common refrain from liberal societies generally is that, look, hey, our openness is being used against us, right? So how do liberal societies counter this without imitating the same behavior that we're trying so hard to fight against?
Again, that's an important issue. China exports, technology that helps other authoritarian regimes suppress their government through surveillance, etc. But again, the answer would be much the same. It's possible to push back at that, and increasingly that is happening, in cooperation between governments and major tech companies, in various ways. You can, just as China and Russia uses disinformation or misinformation by using various social media, we can push back at that by creating, films, by working with the social media to spread democracy. And you can do that in, very constructive ways, and then again, try to empower the general population to become more aware of, misinformation campaigns that can come from, very intransparent sources. So yeah, China has been effective, one of the effective countries in using that together with Russia, but we can do the same. And we have, actually quite good means of doing so. So it's just, again, a matter of being aware of it and using our own power to counter that process. Because I think whilst a lot of governments may like the authoritarianism that China propagates, I think many populations in Central Asia and Southeast Asia are not as keen on the Chinese model, to be honest. So I think we have a lot of opportunities to push back at this.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think I sort of look at it, I think Liselotte mentioned this, right? You look at it from the point of view of the state, and you look at it from the point of view of the individual. And I presume a lot of authoritarian governments are obviously quite chuffed about it. And governments which may not be authoritarian, but will have those tendencies, will also be pretty chuffed about it, right? It's not just that Chinese companies are the only companies that tend to respond to government requests for crackdowns. Other companies do too. So I think the first thing would be from the point of view of having a set of rules in which and the implementation of those rules with regard to information, with regards to sort of misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, which you are extremely familiar with, all three of those phrases, Pratik. So I think a set of rules in terms of how do you deal with them. Governments will always play catch up, law enforcement will always play catch up with this because technology changes so rapidly. So that's the challenge I think that we need to recognize, and that's the challenge that's going to be with us. The other aspect is from the point of view of the individual, is that you need to have greater transparency in terms of how corporations, whether those are Western corporations, your own corporations at home, or Chinese corporations, how they deal with governments, how they deal with sort of data and information. And if you have greater transparency on that, if I know that whether it's Facebook or whether it's Weibo or whether it's WeChat, how it's processing my data, how it's processing government requests, if I know that, I can at least take action with it. The lack of transparency on all that creates a far more sort of suffocating authoritarian environment. So I think those are some of the ways in which probably countries can deal with this.
Okay, one audience question that I'm going to try and get through. There are a lot of questions, but I'm sorry, I won't be able to get to most of them. Tushar is asking, how are Chinese coming back from other countries, influencing or reverse influencing Chinese society? My quick follow-up would be, for example, do they influence China itself?
Briefly, well, it's a difficult question to answer, but I have, frequently been to China, and I have very close relations in China, and I think that the liberal reforms that we saw until Xi Jinping came to power has been rolled back very quickly. I think you should not conflate the Chinese Communist Party with the Chinese people. Some people say, oh, it's ingrained in people's culture. I'm sorry, but just as you don't see Iranians as wedded to the regime, I think it's a mistake to see Chinese people wedded to the regime, even high up in the system. But they're very tightly controlled, especially the Chinese elites. I think even if they go abroad today, they cannot speak freely at all. Also because of the technology and the surveillance it allows. And indeed, I've experienced that myself. So I think people going back to China, unfortunately, it's not easy to influence, the Chinese system. What I do think is happening is that the Chinese system as it is now has severe weaknesses because, a Xi Jinping that tries to be all and powerful does not have backing in the Chinese people. No one likes to live in a golden cage, even if they're high up in the system. This is not what a lot of people desire. And so, but he will not, he will not get the feedback that you get in a more open and transparent society. And I think in many ways that will backfire and weaken, the Chinese at the top from within, to be honest. I think there are also serious weaknesses that we could discuss in the Chinese system. That means that, that we could be better at utilizing and pushing back at the things that we think undermines the world order.
Manoj?
Yeah, I mean, I have little to add on that. I don't think that people going back are really going to influence the regime to change. I really don't think that's going to happen.
Okay, well, very well. On that note, we will have to wrap up. It has been a fascinating discussion. We've talked not just about politics among nations, but also done some amount of soul searching about the state of politics within our own countries. We don't normally get to do that in a discussion on China. So I want to thank both of our panelists for their insights. I want to thank our discussants for their great questions and for making this so interesting. Thank you all for joining us. And before we leave, I do want to point out that this is, again, only the second of six deep webinars that we have. The next one is going to ask, is an economic divorce possible? We are looking at China and the state of the global economy. The US has, recent times been talking about calling for a restructuring of global supply chains. India also sees opportunities there to bring some manufacturing to its own territory. So we'll look at what it means for the global economy, for India's own fairly stalled economic liberalization process, and what trade is going to look like after COVID-19. Thank you again for joining us.